Author Ian Kershaw discusses his book, Hitler, 1889 to 1936, Hubris. It's the first major biography of Adolf Hitler to be published in English in 20 years, and draws on documents not previously available, including the Goebbels diaries recently discovered in Moscow.
Good evening. Welcome to the Boston Public Library Harvard Bookstore Author Series. My name's Ellen Graff. I'm a librarian here, and I want to thank the Harvard Bookstore and Sherry Sable for coordinating this series for the library. I want to remind you that following tonight's program, there'll be a book signing in the lobby right outside the lecture hall where books will be on sale. Also, I want to tell you that C-SPAN will be filming tonight's program, and they will film questions after the lecture, after the talk, and if anyone doesn't want to be filmed but they should sit in that area over there on the right. I guess you can't ask a question if you don't want to be filmed. But if you could write your question down and I could deliver it to Ian Kershaw. Upcoming programs in the series, Leonard Schlane will be here on February 9th, and he will talk about his latest book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And then on February 10th, Arthur Golden will be here again. I think he was here 2 years ago when his book, Memoirs of a Geisha, came out, and he's coming back as the paperback version is about to be published. Tonight's guest is Ian Kershaw, and he is one of the world's leading authorities on Hitler and the Nazis. He has written or edited over 7 books on the subject, and in 1994 he was awarded the Federal Cross of Merit by the President of Germany for his services to German history. He's a professor of modern history at the University of Sheffield in England, and he was recently the historical and script consultant for the BBC for their documentary series on the Nazis, A Warning from History, which was aired in 1997. Please welcome Ian Kershaw.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for that welcome. And let me say at the beginning what a pleasure it is to be able to give this talk this evening, and it's also a great pleasure to be able to return for a second visit to Boston. I was here for 3 memorable days in 1984, I think. The second visit is likely to be so crowded and so short that I doubt that I'll remember too much of it at all. But it's very nice to be back here again just the same. When I was... I'll speak for, obviously now for maybe half an hour or more, and then I really look forward to hearing your questions, do my very best to answer them. When I was sitting in my hotel room early yesterday evening, I was flicking through the 30-odd channels, trying to find something to watch, and passing through various cartoons, old films, religious programs, constant adverts, and of course interminable Monica Lewinsky, when I eventually alighted upon a very short item which caught my attention for a few moments. It was called Voices of the Millennium. And these Voices of the Millennium included a number, of course, of extraordinary significant figures, all of the 20th century. Naturally, we didn't have any recordings of Voices of the Millennium before that, I suppose. But of these, they included Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy and Winston Churchill, and even, somewhat to my surprise, the present British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who hasn't had much of a chance to make his mark on the century before it rapidly runs out. But one voice of the millennium, albeit a very harsh and hate-ridden voice, was not included, and yet I would have thought that of all the voices of the millennium, and for all the wrong reasons, the voice of Adolf Hitler should certainly be included. And if we extend that to say which figures have had the greatest influence on the 20th century, then again, for all the negative reasons, I think it would be difficult to put up a much stronger case than that of Hitler and Hitler's regime, which has influenced our century in such a baleful fashion. Our century has been characterized in good measure, I would think, by war and hatred towards other human beings, inhumanity on a grandiose scale, and of course the combination of that in genocide. War and genocide, the two absolute hallmarks of Adolf Hitler. And this, in part, certainly must explain, I think, why the fascination with Hitler continues more or less unabated. So despite 50 years or more since his death, this fascination remains intact and is a greater fascination than is to be found, I think, with regard to, say, Stalin, who arguably had more people killed than Hitler, or let alone then other dictators such as Mussolini or Franco, who pale into relative insignificance. Hitler, as the author of the most destructive war that history has ever seen, and Hitler as the inspiration of the most terrible genocide that the world has yet seen, has a particular claim on our attention now as before. And this, perhaps alone, would give some justification to the attempt at the end of the century, which in certain measure could be seen, therefore, as Hitler's century. It might give some justification to an attempt to write another full-scale work on Hitler, another biography of Hitler. Now, the Austrian satirist Karl Kraus said in 1933, I can't think of anything to say about Hitler. That was in 1933, in the year that Hitler took power. His view hasn't been universally shared because up to this point, according to a recent estimation, there've been 120,000 works written on Hitler and the Third Reich. Not all of those, of course, biographies, but 120,000 works written on him. We have, therefore, to ask, is there a justification beyond the fascination with Hitler for number 120,001? Books on every conceivable aspect of Hitler have been written. There's even a book on Hitler's sex life. Well, it's an extremely short book. But everything seems to have been covered, and therefore we ask ourselves again, do we need another one? Is there anything left to be said? Well, my answer, of course, is obvious, otherwise I wouldn't have written the book. But before I come on to that question, what the book is about, maybe I can just divert for a few moments to explain how I came to write it. An Englishman none of whose family had suffered in any way during the war. I have no German background, no Jewish background, and so on, and yet I've spent the last 20-odd years studying this most terrible epoch in human history. And how I came to it, if I summarize it very rapidly for you, could begin really with me as a medieval historian at the University of Manchester in England, Manchester where I still live, working on, at that time, on the social history of the 13th and 14th centuries. Probably I already had a bit of a hanging towards calamities and disasters because I wrote a lengthy article on the great famine and agrarian crisis in England between 1315 and 1322. But at the time I was beginning to learn German, more or less as a hobby. And in 1972, having learned German for a couple of years, just in a perfunctory fashion, I got the chance to go to Germany for the first time on an intensive language course in a little place just outside Munich. And while I was there, I read avidly. My German was by that time a lot better. I could read German with some ease by then. And I became aware of the fact that I was more interested in Hitler than Frederick Barbarossa. But while I was there in this little town near Munich, there was an incident which helped me to push me in the direction which I was already inclined to go. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I made my way, doing this language course, made my way into a cafe in this little town and came into conversation with an elderly man there who was just asking me what I was doing in this place as an Englishman. I explained to him, and we got on talking about our different countries and their pasts. And all at once, we were in the Nazi era, and he said, you English, you lost the chance. You should have come in the war with us together. We could have marched against Russia, defeated Bolshevism, and conquered the world. Staggering sentiments which really rocked me back on my heels, and I was rocked back even more a second or two later when he said, in words which I won't forget, Der Jude ist eine Laus. The Jew is a louse. And you can imagine this is the first time I'd ever been open to any such sentiments. I'd obviously come across an ex-Nazi. They are, of course, by now a tiny minority in Germany, and yet I'd come across one, and this set me thinking, what on earth went on in a place like this during the Nazi era? And I started reading all that I could and found, in actual fact, remarkably little. But within a couple of years, I'd been invited to participate, to take part in a major research project that was being run from Munich, from the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, on Bavaria during the Third Reich. And this was an attempt now to look at grassroots opinion, at how ordinary people reacted to this Nazi regime, and how their views were altered. I worked within this project, so I came into work on the Third Reich, therefore not interested in the top, in Hitler, but interested in the bottom, in the behavior and the attitudes of ordinary people. I then went on and wrote a lengthy article on reactions to the persecution of the Jews. And from there, I was invited to work on a book which I eventually published, first in German and then later on in an English version, on popular images of Hitler, how the German people saw Hitler. Again, I wasn't interested in Hitler directly in his personality or in his biography, but in the popular responses to Hitler, why people saw greatness in this individual who didn't appear to have greatness initially bestowed upon him. And from there I wrote another book then on oppositional attitudes to this regime. But these reactions that I was studying pushed me increasingly in the direction of saying, well, why, what sort of things what was the character, the structure of this regime which produced these reactions? So that took me into looking at the nature, the character of the regime itself, and therefore closer to the figure of Hitler. One other anecdote, if I can just mention it here, is that in 1979 I was invited to, still as a novice in the field, to participate in an important conference which took place just outside London. And all the German luminaries were there at this conference. And within minutes, there was, metaphorically speaking, blood on the carpet as these German heavyweights slugged it out between each other. And what struck me was the polarization, absolute polarization of approaches here between those historians who looked no further than Hitler for their answers, that they concentrated almost exclusively upon Hitler's program, his ideology, his will, his wishes, what Hitler said, what he did. This seemed to give them the answers. What came to be known as a very Hitler-centric approach. The alternative view came from those who, if anything, played Hitler's role down, and they tended to look to impersonal structures and non-personal determinants which carried Hitler in their path along with others too. So in this second version, Hitler came close at times to being written out of the script altogether. And I was intrigued by this polarization and thought then what I wanted to do was to see why the polarization had occurred and whether there's a possibility of overcoming it. And that led to another book that I wrote, which was on the historiographical development of the Third Reich, and in these different approaches, Hitler on the one hand, the determining everything, and on the other hand, Hitler reduced in one interpretation to no more than a weak dictator. So that was a further step along the way. So through the structures of the regime and through this historiography, it pushed me inexorably then towards the concentration on Hitler himself and on the man himself. And I was then approached by the English publishing house Penguin in 1989 to write this biography of Hitler. And first of all, I declined and said, I don't think there's any need. There are at least two excellent biographies of Hitler in existence. The two that I was referring to, I still think they're very fine pieces of work, are the works by my countryman, Alan Bullock, published in 1952, and by the German writer Joachim Fest, which appeared in 1973. Now, these two works are, as I said, extremely good biographies of Hitler, but one of them was written half a century ago, the other quarter of a century ago. In the interim, a vast outpouring of works on practically every aspect of the Third Reich has appeared, and beyond that, new source materials have become available, to name just but one here, the complete Goebbels diaries, found a few years ago, not by me, I hasten to add, on glass plates in a Stalinist archive in Moscow. And therefore, from this point of view alone, again, there's something to be said then for having a new look at Hitler and having a fresh approach to it. So Bullock and Fest, one other thing to say about them is that Alan Bullock began his biography by, in the very foreword to it, the preface to it, saying, this is a history of the dictator, not the dictatorship. Now, I don't think 50 years on you can write a history of Hitler in that way. Secondly, Joachim Fest's very stylish, wonderfully stylish biography began with the question, can we call him great? The question of historical greatness. Once more, this leads to a very Hitler-centric approach. Some number of reviewers at the time said that Fest, while strong on Hitler's psychology, was far less strong when it came to looking at the social forces which had made Hitler possible. And the question of historical greatness is one which I put aside straight away. If we answer that question in the affirmative, can we call him great, said Fest, what would have been the case if he'd died at the end of 1938? Would he have gone down as one of the great Germans of all time, just a few weeks, incidentally, after the notorious pogrom against the Jews? But the question of historical greatness seems to me to be, in the end, a non-question. If we answer it with yes, we can call him great, what does that do as how does that help us as an explanation of the Third Reich? Ultimately, it pushes in a direction where the thing is so personalized and where ultimately you have an interpretation that says, here we have a historical genius leading the German people astray. No, I think we have to have another approach, one which actually far more closely tries to locate Hitler in the forces in Germany which made him possible, and that was my own ambition in writing this book. Now, just before I say something a little bit more about that approach and how I tried to deal with it, let me just indicate one or two difficulties which face any biographer of Hitler. Some of these difficulties or problems are problems of a quite ordinary or banal kind, but they're nonetheless important. Problems of the types of source materials that you can use to get at Hitler. Now, Hitler, for 30 years of his life, was absolutely anonymous, a nobody. Between his birth in 1889 and his arrival on the political scene in 1919, nobody had ever heard of Hitler. Hitler himself was a very secretive person throughout his life and did the best he could to conceal any traces of his early existence, but beyond that, the actual traces of his early existence are very fragmentary. And when we're dealing with the types of materials for those early years, we have to treat them with extreme care. They're very sparse, and they have to be treated with extreme care and with great critical attention. So all sorts of myths and legends could be built up about Hitler, which a biographer has to try to cope with and deal with and root through that. There are, of course, lots of psychological interpretations of Hitler, all of which rest upon more or less upon speculation. So those are problems. Then there are problems, if I give you one example of this, you see the nature of the problem. Hitler was, as we all know, the greatest Jew hater of all time, and yet when we ask why he came to hate the Jews, or even when he came to hate the Jews, we can only give answers which rest upon the balance of probabilities. We don't know absolutely for certain. Hitler's own version of this, that that suddenly he discovered the Jew, as he put it, when he encountered a figure in a black kaftan with side locks in a street in Vienna in 1909 or thereabouts, and all at once he asked the question, is this a Jew? And then a few minutes later, is this a German? And the scales, he said, fell from his eyes as he realized that this figure was the key to the whole of human history. And from then on, he started incessantly reading about Jews and came to form his hatred of Jews there and then. Now, that story cannot stand up as Hitler tells it. Jews with kaftans and sidelocks were no rarity on the streets of Vienna. Vienna, an extremely anti-Semitic city at the time. Hitler would undoubtedly have encountered this anti-Semitism before that. He would undoubtedly have encountered the same type of figure that he claimed to have seen on this at this one moment. So what he's doing here is writing in 1924, dramatizing a story, putting it back to 1909, and claiming that he alone came to this recognition of the key to human history without any teacher, on his own accord, and this is a sign, one of the signs, therefore, of his juvenile genius, so to say. The truth is almost certainly far more prosaic than that. Hitler, an anti-Semite in the Vienna days, you could say certainly, although a number of his close associates at the time were actually Jewish, and those around him couldn't later remember any particular anti-Semitic comments, and we don't have any authentic anti-Semitic comments from Hitler until 1919, but that this man in this city at that time was not anti-Semitic is unthinkable. But the anti-Semitism was probably a very conventional anti-Semitism then, and it took the war, the lost war, which Hitler had been elated at the start of the war, devastated at the end of it. It took the lost war and the revolution and the experience of the turmoil in Bavaria, in Munich quite especially, which he saw with his own eyes in 1919. It took that to turn these anti-Semitic hatreds and resentments welling up in Hitler into a fully fledged ideology resting upon the notion that the aim of politics is the removal of the Jew altogether, as he said in his first political writing in September 1919. But that's only to point out that on this crucial point, this crucial issue, we have difficulty in really pinning that down from the source materials available. One other problem is that what might say is Hitler as a black hole at the center of a biography, that outside the political sphere, Hitler really doesn't have much of a biography at all. He's not if you write a biography of Winston Churchill, for example, then you could find plenty outside, Roosevelt or Kennedy or something, you'd find plenty outside their politics which made them interesting individuals. In the case of Hitler, that's not really so at all. And what you have there is the resort is politics intruding into every sphere of life, so that what is left is residual banality. And that makes it difficult to grasp. There's an element of Hitler which no biographer can ever get at, and the reason is probably that there's nothing to get at, that there was nothing there outside this political sphere. So there's an immense problem there of dealing with the mediocrity of the individual and the immensity of the political impact. And that brings me to the approach that I've adopted in this book, and which I think makes it different from the approaches of Bullock and from Fest, was my question that I posed to myself. And historians always write books. It's very nice that other people want to read them, but in the end they always write the books for themselves, first and foremost. And what I wanted to explain for myself was how this individual, who had no obvious talents other than his public speaking ability, his rabble-rousing talent in the Munich beer halls, and before 1918, no visible talent of any sort, with nobody listening to him. So he could give his tirades to his comrades in the army during the war, and before that in the men's home in Vienna, without anybody taking any notice. He was just regarded as an eccentric. So the question was how this figure, who had no obvious claim to great gifts or anything, could be, in a sense, catapulted into the center of politics, how this rank outsider could ever be in a position to take power in such a modern, sophisticated state, in such a cultured country as Germany, and then exercise this power with the terrible consequences which we know only too well. And what I was trying to do in that was to, all the time, to look not necessarily for what Hitler did and what Hitler tried to, what Hitler said, what he dictated, what he determined, but I asked myself the first question: how could that or that take place without Hitler necessarily giving orders? And that was my starting point, really, in this whole, what it seemed to me to be a new approach to a Hitler biography, one which said, why did so many people at this time find heroic qualities in this individual and project these qualities onto him? And I found one guide in the concept of charismatic leadership, which is drawn from the from the German sociologist Max Weber. And Max Weber wrote mainly about religious figures, and it's not just by chance that one can convey this sort of pseudo-religious feeling onto Hitler, because what people were looking for at that time was not politics in the sense that we understand it, but national redemption. And Hitler could be portrayed then, increasingly portrayed, as a type of savior figure, a political savior figure. And the rallies that they had an air almost of sort of revivalist meetings to them at times, rather than conventional political meetings. And if we take this notion of charismatic authority, then what we have are the projection of all sorts of expectations, hopes, utopian visions of the future onto Hitler, and the feeling, even before Hitler himself, of course, an egomaniac, he's a narcissistic personality and so on, so he's receptive to these things. But it takes time before these views of heroic leadership, which are current in German society, in certain sections of it, before anybody's ever heard of Hitler, that these become projected on such an inherently unlikely candidate. That takes place, you can see it beginning to shape up within the early Nazi movement, round about 1922-23, especially following Mussolini's so-called March on Rome. That's the beginning, really, where these ideas start to be projected onto Hitler. And after the failed coup d'etat, the putsch, the beer hall putsch of November 23, when Hitler's imprisoned, or before he's imprisoned at the trial there, he takes full responsibility for the coup on himself. He is made into a hero on the extreme racist right, and while he's imprisoned thereafter, he has this adulation poured on him and reflects there upon him, no longer sees himself as paving the way for the great leader to come, but sees himself as that great leader in person. And so this is the incorporation then of charismatic leadership, I think, onto Hitler. Hitler is the embodiment of all sorts of expectations, all sorts of hopes, all sorts of resentments, hatreds, and so on, which were current in certain sections of German society at that time. And I use one other device here, which is a sort of leitmotif in the book. And I found it in a routine speech by a Nazi functionary in 1934. And in this speech, this Nazi functionary, his name is Werner Willekens, he said something along the following lines. He said, the Führer, by this time, of course, Hitler's been in power now for about 18 months or so, he said, the Führer cannot be expected to dictate everything from above. On the contrary, it is the duty of everyone in the new Germany to work towards the Führer along the lines he would wish. Anyone not doing that will discover soon enough that he's on the wrong track. But those who work towards the Führer along the lines that he will wish will find one day the sudden confirmation of their work through laws, and that will be their ultimate reward. Now, if you think of this now, this enables, this working towards the Führer idea enables us to see that society working along a sort of dialectic where Hitler stands for the great national objectives, the distant goals. He puts forward the vision. The vision is, of course, a horrendous one of removal of Jews and of ultimate expansion and conquest through the sword, as he said on numerous occasions, racial purification and racial imperialism. But Hitler's views, although they were often expressed in the most brutal language imaginable, were also expressed in somewhat vague language. And therefore they could be interpreted in different ways by different people for different reasons. But these ideas, therefore, could serve to activate the activist, to push along the activism from below, to allow initiatives to come forward which don't necessarily need all the time diktats from above. And let me just give you a couple of examples of how that can work, how this dynamism from below can come about. One example would be in the case of denunciation. Now, in this society, everybody was denouncing everybody else. And Hitler didn't order this to be done. He just took the lid off what was possible in the society and enabled people to do this. And when we were making the series of TV films that were referred to earlier on, we found a woman near Würzburg in Bavaria, Franconia, who had effectively denounced her neighbour. And we confronted this woman with a document which she'd signed, and she accepted it was her signature. She said, I've no idea how that signature came to be on there, but she accepted that it was her signature. And she denounced a neighbour to the Gestapo, and the neighbour had been arrested and some while later had actually died in a concentration camp. And we asked her why she denounced her neighbour, and she said, well, we thought she didn't really fit in. She was an outsider in our community. She looked a bit odd. She had some weird friends who came to visit her. They thought she might be a lesbian, and she looked Jewish. And those were the reasons, not that she'd done anything particular. And we also asked this woman then whether she was a Nazi or what her views about the regime at all. No, she said, well, not at all. We were never Nazis. My father wouldn't even allow me to join the girls' league. So she rejected the notion it was a Nazi. She denounced her neighbour for these reasons that I've just given. She wasn't working towards the Führer in an overt sense, doing that because Hitler had told her to do or whatever. But the functional significance of what she was doing was nonetheless, in a very tiny way, to push along the radicalization still further. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is how this radicalization from the bottom feeds into Hitler's objectives at the top. Another example would be in the euthanasia action. That'll be dealt with in the second volume, but there you have the extraordinary entity of doctors whose job is normally to save life, to preserve life, actually recommending their patients for the so-called euthanasia action, that is to say, to be killed, recommending them without any orders from above. They weren't told they had to do this, they just did it. Or one other example, final example I'll give you, in the Jewish question itself, so-called, where if you look at it from the point of view from what Hitler did in the 1930s, as many writers have pointed out, Hitler's own role is hidden in the shadows at that time. And Hitler said in 1941, looking back, for years I had to remain inactive in the Jewish question, for tactical reasons, of course. But nonetheless, the radicalization proceeds. And when you look at developments, for example, the genesis of the notorious Nuremberg laws in 1935, then you see that that to describe how Hitler comes onto the scene only during the Nuremberg rally of 1935, and the laws are proclaimed at that time. But the genesis of those laws has to be described without much recourse to Hitler himself, and that's what I've tried to do. So if you compare my treatment of the Nuremberg laws with that of Bullock or Fest, then what you'll see is that in Bullock and Fest there's very short passages on them. In my book I've got a lot on them, but Hitler only comes into the scene at towards the end. Now, through this, therefore, what I've been trying to do here, and I'll draw to a close at this point and then look forward to your questions, but what I've been trying to do in this is to portray Hitler, therefore, in one sense, as the product of his society. Now, in one way, of course, we're all products of our society, and that's just a banality. But here, what I've been trying to suggest is that Hitler, outside the conditions that prevailed in Germany at the end of the the First World War and through the 20s and early 30s would have been unthinkable. Before 1914, a Hitler on the Chancellor's seat in Germany, absolutely unthinkable. After 1945, in the absolutely changed conditions following a war, which of course he brought about, again, it's unthinkable that such a figure could have reached the pinnacle of politics. But in these conditions, there are conditions, let's just remind ourselves, of national humiliation, economic bankruptcy, failed democracy, lost war, search for political salvation. A figure such as Hitler could be seen to have his uses by the leading groups, by the upper echelons of, first of all, Bavaria in the early 20s and then of Germany itself in the early 30s, and in those conditions be brought to the forefront of politics and into a position where he could be hoisted into the Chancellor's seat. So first of all, as a product of society, but nonetheless, I'm also at pains to say that Hitler was absolutely indispensable to this regime, because the incorporation in the figure of Hitler of all these aspirations, the hopes and the resentments and hate feelings and so on, this meant that his own position as charismatic leader, as this type of heroic, almost deified figure, was able to lead to the increasing separation of Hitler from any constraints in that regime, to the point where later on in the regime's history, he was certainly in a position then to take decisions without any expectation that these would be blocked or would be prevented from being realized in practice. So Hitler was absolutely indispensable, irreplaceable, and if you say, put in two examples there, without Hitler, I'd say no general European war at the end of the 1930s. Without Hitler, no Holocaust. One couldn't really say it more plainly than that. There would have been, of course, national expansionist tendencies. There would have been discrimination against Jews. But I think Hitler's role is so crucial that those developments could have not have taken place without his authorization. But finally here, Hitler in this book is seen very much in terms of the role which he played to absolute perfection throughout. That is the role of Führer. And Hitler, the individual, I said before, is a sort of black hole. Hitler, the individual, is subsumed into Hitler, the Führer figure, and in that figure, once more, absolutely indispensable as the activator of the activists, as the legitimator of initiatives frequently taken by others. So I said at the end of my introduction to this book that Nazism represents the most direct challenge in the 20th century to the bases of civilization on which our societies rest. And Hitler was in that the epicenter of that attack on civilization, but he wasn't its primary cause. I end this book in 1936, following the German triumph in the Rhineland, the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Hitler is at one of the high points of his internal power. Power is consolidated. Opposition of any meaningful kind really has ceased to exist, or at any rate is not in position to challenge Hitler. Then, and yet, even at this time, where the book ends, we can see the tendencies there which are already pressing for continuing ceaseless radicalization. It's a regime that can't stand still. Externally, the Western allies have given way already on a number of occasions. Internally, we can see the way things are going. But all around, internally and externally, there's a massive amount of blindness. What we are seeing internally, therefore, and externally, is that the pressures are building up which are going to take that regime in the very near future then beyond internal power consolidation into external expansion, into increasing threat of war, then war, and with that even greater radicalization now imposed upon the subjugated populations of Europe, and we can see how things develop now, not just into war, but into war of an unheard of kind, and into genocide, finally to the apocalyptic events of Europe in 1944 and 45. Those are, of course, the the themes of my second volume, which is well on its way to completion. But for now, we're talking about Volume 1. Look forward to hearing your questions, and thank you very much for your patient attention. Thank you. Please, at the front here.
You talked a lot about the societal factors that created Hitler, but you didn't mention, I don't think, the idea that he was a puppet of the industrialists who were using him as a tool against communism. What do you have to say about that?
I didn't say very much about Hitler as the puppet of the industrialists who were using him as a tool against communism. Hitler certainly was regarded by all sorts of important groupings, first of all in Bavaria and then later on beyond Bavaria, as the rouser of the masses, and one of the key factors of this, you're quite right to emphasize it, was the destruction of communism, the weaning over of workers and other groups from any possible attractions of communism and Marxism more generally, winning them over to the nationalist cause, and the outright destruction of communism. In that, Hitler therefore was regarded by them as the drummer up of support from the masses, as somebody they could use, in the sense that there was an outright that Hitler was, to say, the marionette or the puppet of the industrialists. Henry Ashby Turner from Yale University, I think, has long since undermined that interpretation and been able to demonstrate that one has to look at the role of the industrialists and Hitler's rise to power in a much more variegated fashion. And certainly after 1933, the situation altered diametrically once Hitler was in power, and the industrialists could benefit from this regime massively. So the industrialists certainly contributed inordinately, along with the other big power groups, towards the undermining of the Weimar democracy, which paved the way for Hitler to take power. They contributed less directly to the actual takeover of power by Hitler himself, and there maybe one would look to other groups, maybe the agrarians, the landowners, as being more important than the industrialists themselves. Please here at the...
Yes, a Russian historian in a recent biography of Stalin suggests the possibility that Hitler and Stalin met secretly in October of 1939, possibly conquered Poland. Do you know of any evidence to support this claim?
The claim that Hitler and Stalin met secretly in October 1939? No, I don't think there's any evidence for that claim. Just about 5 rows back. Yes, sir, please. Yes.
Two related questions, one on the inevitability of the rise of Hitler, and then specifically the uniqueness of the German experience being a factor of that.
The inevitability of the rise of Hitler, I would say that Hitler was not inevitable. Hitler's takeover of power, if that's what you mean by his ultimate triumph, Hitler's takeover of power is not inevitable until around about 12 o'clock on the morning of the 30th of January 1933. Increasingly from 1930, I think you could say that the end of the Weimar Republic, the end of democracy in Germany, was inevitable. But Hitler was one possibility out of that, not the only one. Military dictatorship looked for a long time as if it was more likely than a Nazi takeover. So not inevitable, and one of the things I've tried to show in the book is that, and in a way you can do that through a biographical narrative, is that history could have taken a different turn at different moments, and Hitler certainly had the luck of the devil on his side. And if I mention it, for example, in 1923 at the march through Munich, the chap who was linking arms with Hitler was shot dead. The bullet had been 18 inches to the side. History would have been different. And there are lots of moments like that in Hitler's life. So Hitler, an inevitability, no. So I think we separate the two things and say end of democracy after 30, maybe 31 at the latest, yes, but inevitability that it would be that Hitler would succeed, no, not until really he did succeed on the 30th of January. How much was this a peculiarly German phenomenon. I think we have to see there that on the one hand we can look to trends which were current in many parts of Europe. After all, heroic leadership ideas were not solely confined to Germany. We see leadership cults developing in Italy and in other countries. But I think nonetheless we can see specific elements in Germany which meant that, that what emerged had a very specific German colouring, and Hitler himself was able to build upon and to incorporate indeed the sorts of ideological strands which were rampant in Germany in sections of the extreme right already before the World War I. They weren't dominant by any means at that stage, and the notion that German history somehow has to culminate in history is again a massive oversimplification. But certainly there were these strands in German political culture before 1914. After the First World War took them into into much greater potency, and in the changed conditions after that, these ideas initially on the fringes had the potential to come into the mainstream, which they did then only in the conditions of the Great Depression and the total crisis of the state between 1930 and 1933. There was another question here, please, yes.
What, in your opinion, was there in Hitler's past that made him play this perfect part of the Fuhrer, enabled him to take it on?
That's a difficult question. What was there in Hitler's past which so equipped him to take on this role of the Fuhrer and play it to such perfection? I don't really think there was anything that one could put one's finger on quite specific in his past, but what you see in the early Hitler are already from the memoirs of his boyhood, his sole boyhood friend, August Kubitschek. Even that he had one friend points to already a distance from people, an isolation, the sense that he doesn't easily make human contact. This isolation comes through as part of the detachment from everything else that fits into the Führer role later on. But already in these early years, one sees another thing, which is the grandiose fantasy which comes about. When he's walking around Linz and then Vienna with immense building plans in his head and speculating on the future and so on. This is, again, we see signs of the Hitler, later on the know-all, of course, who pontificates on everything under the sun. But that is another strand, the fantasy, which goes into it. So you put those two things together and then add on the experience of the war and the experience of the ordinary soldier. He never got beyond the grade of corporal, of course. Then we have in the wartime experience, where he saw it from below and not from above. He wasn't an officer and so on. We have once more an element of the myth here of the ordinary soldier, who was at the same time the far-seeing visionary leader. But the one thing that I'd stress, which is what I was saying in the talk, was that Hitler himself even then didn't see himself for a number of years as this great leader. It wasn't that he'd been sort of working up to this for the whole of his boyhood period and so on, as he would like us to think from his own account in Mein Kampf, but rather that these ideas were then projected onto him, and the ideas were in circulation in conservative circles in Germany before the Nazis, and Hitler in particular, took them on himself. So I think it's not so much that we look back to his past and say what fitted him out to see, as to say why, following the failed putsch in Munich and in his period of imprisonment, he could accept this adulation and accept that these views were imposed on him, take them on himself, and then from there on begin to play this role also for functional necessity in terms of uniting the party. I think he just, like many people, grew into the role. There's one at the halfway up there, please, yes.
My understanding is that Hitler supported himself in his younger years, when he was in Vienna and in Berlin, by painting. I'd be interested in Munich. Yeah, I'd be interested to know if anyone has ever seen what the subject matter was and why they were sold, fairly easily for him to be able to support himself.
Yes, the pictures have been, some of them have been viewed for quite a number of years now, and they're all of them, almost without exception, I think, they're street scenes or pictures of picturesque spots in Vienna, then later on in Munich. Very few people on them. They're buildings, usually classical buildings, painted in a realistic style. Hitler wasn't a bad painter in an amateurish sense. He wasn't terrible. He just didn't have the attributes ever to make the artistic genius which he envisaged himself as becoming. And he failed, of course, to get into the Viennese Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 and again in 1908, an immense shock to his own self-esteem. But he wasn't on his own in that, and they took only a very small percentage of the applicants, and in fact a later director of the Academy also failed to get in the same year as Hitler. So it didn't make him a terrible painter, but he was never going to be a very good painter. So what he was able to do was to eke out a living, as many people still do actually, in and around Munich, in the beer halls in Munich. They go in and they paint little pictures of tourist spots in Munich and in Vienna, and they hawk them around the beer halls, and they can make some sort of living from it. And that's what Hitler did. And when he came out of the First World War at the end of 1918, far from having a political career lined up, he says to him in Mein Kampf, another fable, he says when he was in the hospital in Pasewalk in the end of 1918, blinded from poison gas, he heard the news of Germany's defeat and the revolution, and I decided then, he stated, to go into politics. That wasn't the case. When he came out of that, he had no idea what he was going to do. Stay in the army as long as possible, and then probably sell his paintings again. So one important part of this book is to try to demythologize Hitler in all sorts of ways, and these little ways are included in that. There was one here towards the front here, please, and then we'll take the one at the back. Sorry, I'm having you running around. Yeah, please.
Do you think there's any validity at all to the thesis expressed by Kimberly Cornish in his recent book, The Jew of Linz, where he says that the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein may have been the catalyst for Hitler's anti-Semitism when they were both in grade school at Linz, Hitler being about 2 years older?
Yes, is there any justification, the view that Hitler's anti-Semitism dates back to the fact that Wittgenstein was in the same school as Hitler, 3 years older, in Linz? I think there's no justification for that argument at all. In fact, Hitler himself in Mein Kampf says that at that time he wasn't anti-Semitic. That's unlikely to be strictly speaking true, because he was already in the Linz period a supporter of the Schönerer movement, which is a pan-German movement run by Georg Schönerer, who himself was a racial anti-Semite. So it's unlikely that Hitler was not anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, but what is the case is that anti-Czech feeling is much stronger. That's one point. And the second is that if he was an anti-Semite at that time, which is probable, then it was of a very ordinary kind. Not, in other words, Hitler in the Linz era was certainly not the Hitler, the pathological anti-Semite that we see later, and we see, in my view, only in 1919, and as a consequence, above all, not of any encounter with Wittgenstein or any other single individual, but as the circumstances which developed in Munich in that year. And if I may just add one other point on that, which I would also use against the Wittgenstein type argument or any particular encounter with an individual Jew, is that Hitler's hatred it seems to me, not just of Jews, but quite particularly of Jews, to be an abstract one. That he had the great capacity for massive abstract hatreds. It wasn't that he hated a particular Jew or had an encounter. We've got these other stories about Hitler and the Jewish doctor who treated his mother, who, of course, later on died of a painful death of cancer. But there too, Hitler's own response to this individual Jew at the time was to thank him very much and to give him his presents of his little postcards, and later on in the 1930s he treated him relatively leniently and allowing him to get out of Vienna in 1938. So an overt sort of hatred for this one Jew, again, is not perceptible. What we have is an abstract hatred of Jews who are seen as the root cause of all the evils in the world. And in fact, one could say is that the key, probably the key explanation for Hitler's political career, if we can call it that, is his determination to reverse the defeat of Germany in 1918 and the revolution that followed it, and the Jews were seen as the cause of that defeat. So again, it was the Jews as an abstraction, not a particular one. So I think for all these reasons, there's nothing really to commend the Wittgenstein story. Please, right at the back.
I guess months ago, there was an article in the New York Observer which posited that Henry Ford and Hitler had a very interesting relationship, and that they wrote each other, and that in fact Hitler was very much inspired by Henry Ford, perhaps in some ways of his anti-Semitism, but also and most importantly because of his implementing modern industrial systems, which then became a model for Hitler in the concentration camps. And I was wondering if in your research you have found this to be true, and if so, to what extent?
Well, thank you for the question and the influence of Henry Ford on Hitler. I don't know of this correspondence, certainly that you were referring to there, but that Hitler was an admirer of Henry Ford and of American techniques in general, especially in the automobile industry. That much is certainly true. And he wasn't alone in this, because leading German industrialists and in the early 1930s, especially after Hitler had come to power, and leading figures in the motor car industry were themselves looking across the Atlantic to America for their model here. The motorization policies were drawn from America. And they were then, they got Hitler's absolute backing right from the start, so instinctively he supported these policies, which gave, of course, also then a great boost to reviving other parts of the economy from 1933 onwards, and also took up old plans, of course, for motorways, which were current before the Nazis came to power, and used these plans then to build up the Autobahnen, and hence then the myth of the great founder or the creator of the motorways. But the final point you were making about, was this incorporated into concentration camps? That's an extrapolation. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that Hitler used Henry Ford's ideas or Henry Ford's techniques as such then to deploy them in the concentration camps. And in any case, when it came to that, Hitler was very happy to leave the concentration camp domain in terms of its practical workings to his leading henchmen, Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. Please, over here, yeah. I think we'd better make this the last question, though it's, we're going to keep to our schedule.
Just want to know, do you have the remains of this man? And if so, could you do any kind of genetic research on it?
Thank you. Do we have any remains of Hitler? And if so, can any genetic experiments be conducted with those remains? To the best of my knowledge and the best of historical research, as far as I'm aware, part of Hitler's chin bone remains in Moscow and is not easily accessible. Other than that, there's very little, and the story that the Russians had actually captured the charred body of Hitler and taken it back to Moscow and conducted an autopsy on it, which led to the publication in the 1960s of a book by a man called Lev Bezimensky, called On the Death of Adolf Hitler. That has been subjected to scrutiny, and that so-called autopsy report has been shown to be absolutely riddled with error and with it's an autopsy report of creative ingenuity. It's as good as impossible that autopsy report was carried out on the body of Adolf Hitler. So it is the case then, to the latest information on it is that all that remains of Hitler, or remains of the burnt body outside the bunker in 1945, is this chin bone which found its way back to Moscow. Whether any genetic work can be done on that or not, I couldn't rightly say. I think at that point we have to draw things to a close, so I thank you once again for the questions you've asked and for your patient attention. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, at least more. At least. I think there were 4 altogether. Yeah. 4 altogether. Thank you. That's very nice. We shall write this to B-O-double-N-Y. I. Okay. Keep it all for a second till it dries.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's very nice to see you.
But sometimes there's...
Shall I write this to
Tonight.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
That was an excellent talk.
Thank you. Very nice. It's a bit daunting to do these things.
You do it very often.
This is only the second I've done here, but I want to do some not-dissimilar talks. They're always a bit different, but not-dissimilar ones in England and in Germany.
It struck me that a number of the questions you asked reminded me of the types of questions that an American historian, actually Hungarian John Lucas asked. So
Yeah, I know.
You're familiar with his...
Yes, I am. Yeah, of course.
Really?
Yeah. He came to see me in England when he was writing it.
When he wrote his Hitler and History?
Yeah, but while he was in the prison, so he came to see me. I had one talk with him in
Really?
Sheffield. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he seized on other things which are good as well. So I wrote a nice review of this book in an English journal.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
Spectator.
Yeah. I've read a number of his books.
Yeah, he did an interesting one called Hitler and the Duel, Hitler and Churchill.
Yes, yes, I did. Yeah.
I had to read that for the sake of
Well, thank you.
pleasure. Hello. Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice to say so. Okay. Thank you. Shall I make this introduction? My name is David. David. Sunday school David as well. He helped me do some of the reference checking. I haven't seen it. Quite controversial. Of course, yeah. But Hitler and right not to believe it was 13. Yeah, which I thought was rather appropriate. In one sense, yeah, but it's far too low, I'm afraid. Yeah. When is your second? Probably next year. It'll be out next year. I hope to finish it this summer. I think I will finish it this summer, and it'll be out then next year in England, probably exactly a year after this. Sorry, 2000 or 2 years after this, I think it is. So 2011, probably in Germany, 2000 in the USA. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I was going to ask you a question.
No, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I was curious about what you thought of bullshit. But basically,
no, narcissism is more nuanced and differentiated than you read that. I mean, Goldhagen has this view that German society was really thirsting for the elimination of the Jews right through the 19th century. My view would be entirely different to that, and would see even in the Third Reich as much more varied in the approach to that. Emphasise much more the short-term changes, emphasise too the way in which once the Nazis are in power, then anti-Semitism, it pervades everything, then every institution becomes like that period between 33 and 41. And I think Gortari doesn't give sufficient attention to those changes in that period. So I don't actually like his book.
A lot of controversy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you make it to Shirley?
In here?
Wherever.
Shirley.
Ben.
To Shirley and Dan. Ben. Sorry, Ben.
It's all her stories for and then also to him. He wrote them and said that.
Ellen?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. No, but some of my best friends are Sommerberg specialists. I know very well Hans Ulrich Wehler in Biography. Jürgen Koch and one or two others. And so I'm well acquainted with those ideas. And of course, I mean, what I was saying is that there are certainly trends that run through, which is that I would emphasise much more than the big change that comes at the end of World War I, rather than see this as sort of Thank you. Thanks.
I hope it's neither of them is painful.
That's absolutely so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. I've got a card I can give you. I don't have any an email address. Okay. Fine, yeah, we're doing a second series of television films now on Hitler's war in the East, Soviet Germany. That's very good. Okay, and you. Thank you.
Now you get to sign one for me. Sherry, S-H-E-R-I.
I should send you, yeah, that's okay. I should send you that article from the New York Observer, probably. Right. Then we're going to have to sign this out at the store. And Ellen's going to want you to sign one for her, and then you get to go home. Well, not home, but at least to the hotel. Do you have other stops in the States?
Ian Kershaw has written or edited over 7 books on Hitler and the Nazis. Also, he's been awarded the Federal Cross of Merit by the President of the Federal Republic of Germany for his service to German history. W.W. Norton and Company published this book, and for more information, you can click on their website at www.norton.com. Book TV focuses on biographies every Sunday at noon, 6, and midnight Eastern Time.